It all started on what should have been a normal Thursday morning. I was out back on my ranch, coffee in hand, getting ready to shut down the pool for the season. The sun was just starting to climb over the trees, casting a soft glow over the water. It had been a long, hot summer, and I figured now was as good a time as any to clean the pool, drain it a bit, and prep it for the colder months. My property spans about 10 acres on the edge of town, and the pool sits right behind my ranch house, fully fenced, fully private, and completely on my land. Or so I thought. I hadn't even finished turning the valve to start draining when I heard the shrill voice of none other than Karen, our local HOA president, self-declared community watchdog and queen of unnecessary drama. She must have been watching me from her window like a hawk, because not even 10 minutes after I started the job, there she was, stomping down the gravel road that separates our properties, phone already in hand, yelling like I just dumped a barrel of toxic waste into the river. "Excuse me. What do you think you're doing?" She screeched through the bars of my gate, pointing at the pool like it had personally offended her. I blinked, confused, and told her calmly, "I'm just draining it for maintenance. It's the end of the season, Karen. It's normal." But Karen, as usual, wasn't interested in explanations. She launched into a full-blown rant about how I was violating HOA water disposal rules and damaging community property. That last part made me laugh out loud. I said, "This isn't community property, it's my property. The pool is on my private land." But she just glared at me and started tapping furiously on her phone screen. "You'll be hearing from the authorities," she hissed. I should have known she meant it literally. Within 5 minutes, I heard the distant whine of sirens coming down the road. I looked up from coiling the hose and couldn't believe what I was seeing. 2 sheriff's deputies, lights flashing, pulled into my drive like they were responding to an emergency. One of them stepped out, looked around, clearly unsure of why they'd even been called. "We received a report of someone illegally dumping pool water into public drainage," he said, glancing back toward Karen, who was standing behind the fence like a proud tattletale. I stayed calm. This wasn't the first time Karen had tried to pull something like this. I reached into my back pocket and handed the officer a folder I had kept just for situations like this. Inside was my property deed, maps, and a letter from my lawyer proving that my entire ranch, including the pool area, was not under HOA jurisdiction. A fact Karen conveniently continued to ignore. The officer read through the documents carefully, then looked up and nodded. "Looks like everything's in order," he said. "You're well within your rights to drain the pool." Karen, still behind the fence, was yelling now. "He's lying. That water goes into the same system we all use. He's polluting the environment." The officer turned to her and asked, "Ma'am, do you have any proof of that?" She paused, sputtered, and then muttered something about HOA bylaws. That's when I had enough. I turned to the officer and said, "Sir, I'd like to file a formal complaint. This woman has repeatedly trespassed on my property, harassed me, and now she's misused emergency services to make a false report." The other deputy took notes, clearly getting tired of Karen's antics. And here's the kicker. What Karen didn't know was that her little power trip just set off a chain of events that would come back to bite her and the entire HOA in a way they never expected. You see, about a year ago, I had hired a lawyer to look into something strange. The HOA had been charging me yearly dues, sending violation notices, even threatening legal action over things like grass height and livestock pens. But when we looked into the county property records, we discovered a major clerical mistake that dated back nearly 2 decades. My land, including the pool and outbuildings, had never officially been annexed into the HOA's jurisdiction. Somewhere along the line, the HOA had simply assumed authority over all nearby lots, even though they had no legal claim to mine. That mistake had been buried under years of lazy record-keeping until Corinne's complaints forced me to dig it up. So not only was I not breaking any rules by draining my pool, but the HOA had been charging me illegally for over 5 years. And now, thanks to Corinne's 911 stunt, I had legal justification to take action. As the officers left with no action taken against me, Corinne stood there, red-faced and furious. "You think you've won, don't you?" she snapped. I just smiled and said, "No, Corinne, you lost the moment you picked up that phone." What she didn't realize is that the wheels were already in motion. The complaint I filed that morning wasn't just about harassment. It was about exposing years of HOA misconduct. And soon, the very organization she worshipped would be at the center of a scandal that would shake the entire neighborhood. All because I decided to clean my pool. It's funny how small things can lead to big changes. And in this case, Corinne's little tantrum would end up costing the HOA millions. But at that moment, standing there with the sun shining, the pool slowly draining, and Karen fuming just beyond my fence, I had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole was about to go. But I was more than ready to follow it. The next morning, things got a whole lot more interesting. I woke up to find an official HOA violation notice taped to my front gate. Not mailed, not emailed. Taped like some high school drama. In big, bold letters, it read, "Emergency cease and desist. Illegal alteration of community water features." They were really trying to paint my pool as some sort of public water system now. I couldn't believe it. They even included a photo clearly taken from behind a bush or something, with me crouched next to the pool pump, like I was committing a crime. Corinne wasn't just involved, she was escalating. That's when I realized this wasn't just a neighbor being nosy. This was personal for her. She wanted control. She wanted a win. And she was using every tool the HOA had, even the ones they weren't legally allowed to use to get it. The funny part was, I had already told the HOA a year ago about the land deed situation. I'd sent them certified letters explaining that my property had never legally joined the association and that I wanted no further contact or fees. They ignored it. Instead of checking their own records, they kept acting like I was some rogue resident refusing to follow their made-up rules. And Corinne, with her inflated sense of power, had taken it upon herself to become the HOA's enforcer. So that day, I called my lawyer again. He'd helped me uncover the jurisdictional mistake last year, and I figured if Corinne and the HOA wanted a fight, we'd give them one, but by the book. He suggested we file a civil harassment complaint against Karen personally and a formal cease and desist against the HOA board for repeated overreach. But he also said something else. Let's hit them where it really hurts accountability. Turns out, once you prove an HOA is violating the law, especially when it comes to things like property boundaries, public resources, or utilities, you can trigger a state-level audit. And that's exactly what we did. That same week, my lawyer contacted the State Housing Oversight Commission and submitted a complaint with full documentation, maps, timelines, correspondence, copies of fees I'd been charged, and even video of Karen yelling through my fence. We didn't have to exaggerate anything, she made it easy. Within 10 days, I got a notice back that a state investigator had been assigned to the case. The fire had been lit, but back on the ranch, things weren't quiet. Corinne wasn't done. She started walking by my property 3 or 4 times a day, sometimes standing by the fence just staring. It was creepy. Then I noticed my irrigation valve box had been tampered with. A neighbor later told me Karen had been poking around it with a flashlight at night. That was enough for me. I installed new cameras around the property, and sure enough, I caught her snooping again the following evening. I turned that footage over to both the sheriff and the state investigator. Meanwhile, word started spreading in the neighborhood. Other residents, many of whom I'd barely talked to, started reaching out quietly. One family told me the HOA had fined them $500 for putting up Halloween decorations 2 days early. Another said their backyard shed got red tagged by Karen, even though it was approved by the city. The more stories I heard, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just targeting me. She'd made a habit out of bullying anyone who didn't bend to her version of the rules. And here's where it got really interesting. During the state review, the investigator found out that not only was my property exempt from HOA authority, but the HOA had been misrepresenting their jurisdiction on dozens of properties. They'd claimed their boundary extended into parcels that were never legally part of the HOA agreement. That's a huge violation, both civil and administrative. And it gets worse. The HOA had been accessing underground water and sewer lines, running under certain homes including mine without permits or inspection reports. They were supposed to coordinate all work with the local utility board. They never did so when Karen called the cops on me for environmental violation. She unknowingly opened the door for the state to inspect her own board's illegal utility usage. What they found shocked even the investigator. The HOA had been diverting community water through a secondary, unauthorized pipe system to irrigate the front entrance landscaping. They had no idea that this made them liable for unregulated water usage, which violated county codes and triggered environmental penalties. At this point, the investigation snowballed. The HOA's entire board, including Karen, was subpoenaed for documents. Their financial records were reviewed. And surprise, surprise, more issues surfaced. Over $40,000 in landscaping expenses had no receipts. Thousands more were logged as miscellaneous office costs. It was starting to look like not only were they enforcing rules illegally, they might have been mismanaging funds. Karen, once smug and confident, began disappearing from the public eye. She stopped patrolling the streets. Her car was no longer parked by the HOA clubhouse every morning. Rumors spread that she'd been advised by her lawyer to stay quiet until the audit was complete, but by then, it was too late. The investigator had everything he needed. He contacted me directly and said, "Your complaint exposed serious legal violations. This is going to result in state enforcement." I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because I knew what was coming next would be bigger than anything Karen or the HOA ever expected. They came after me for draining a pool, but they ended up draining their own future. And while I waited for the final report to come in, I kept my cool. I didn't retaliate. I didn't gloat. I just let the truth do what it always does rise. The same pool they tried to use as a weapon against me had become the center of a case that would bring down years of unchecked power and corruption. And Karen? She had no clue she had just triggered the fuse that would blow everything up. A month passed, and the neighborhood had gone quiet, almost too quiet. The HOA meeting stopped abruptly, their website went offline, and Karen's once proud community bulletins mysteriously vanished from the entrance board. But behind the scenes, the storm that Karen had unknowingly summoned was building strength. I didn't say much during that time. I just kept doing what I always did, tending the ranch, fixing fences, walking my dog around the property, and waiting for the official word from the state. My lawyer said everything was in place. The state audit had wrapped up. All the evidence was in, and the ruling would be released in a few days. But even before the paperwork hit, the dominoes had already started to fall. The first call I got wasn't from my lawyer. It was from my neighbor 2 lots down, Mrs. Henderson, a sweet retired teacher who mostly kept to herself. She told me someone had knocked on her door early that morning. Not the HOA, not Karen. It was a state investigator and 2 agents from the county compliance office. They were collecting impact statements from residents who had been affected by HOA overreach, specifically in situations where Karen or other board members had enforced rules without proper authority. Mrs. Henderson said she told him everything, how Karen had fined her for putting up a wooden bird feeder, how they forced her to remove a bench from her front yard that had been there for over 10 years. The state agents were kind, respectful, and told her she wasn't alone. They'd spoken to over 20 residents already. That's when I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. Karen had created a pattern of abuse that stretched far beyond our little property line feud. And now, her paper trail of control, fines, and intimidation was unraveling in real time. What surprised everyone, though, was how fast the consequences came once the final audit report was made public. The HOA had been found guilty of multiple violations, illegal jurisdiction claims, unauthorized use of public resources, environmental regulation breaches, and financial mismanagement of member dues. But it was the unauthorized water diversion system, the very one they had tried to accuse me of abusing, that landed them in the deepest trouble. Turns out that system had been operating without a permit for nearly 7 years. No inspections, no maintenance records, no county oversight, and it wasn't just watering bushes and trees. Part of that system had leaked into a protected runoff area behind the community's east gate, zone designated by the county as environmentally sensitive due to its wildlife population. That discovery alone carried a fine of over $1.2 million. Combine that with the HOA's fraudulent claims over my property and a dozen others, and they were now on the hook for a total of $2.5 million in penalties and damages. Word spread fast. Local news reporters showed up in the neighborhood, cameras rolling. One afternoon, I stepped outside to find a news van parked across the road. The anchor approached and asked if I'd be willing to give a statement, considering the HOA dispute had started with a 911 call about my pool. I kept it simple. All I ever wanted was to be left alone on land I legally own. They turned it into a fight. The state just made it right. The next day, the story ran on the evening news. HOA hit with $2.5 million fine after harassing ranch owner over private pool. Karen's face didn't appear in the segment, but her name was mentioned along with her resignation from the HOA board, which had been submitted under pressure just hours before the fine was announced. But even that wasn't enough to stop the fallout. Residents began organizing a full overhaul of the HOA leadership. A petition circulated calling for an emergency election. Over 70% of the neighborhood signed it within 48 hours. One by one, board members stepped down, most of them too embarrassed or too scared to face the consequences. Karen had vanished entirely, rumor had it. She'd gone to stay with family out of state, hoping to avoid media attention. Meanwhile, the county issued a restraining order preventing Karen or any former board member from engaging in any HOA-related decisions until the matter was legally resolved. A special state trustee was appointed to manage HOA affairs temporarily, and all enforcement actions were frozen until a legal audit of every property could be completed. For the first time in years, the neighborhood had no one watching over its every move, and the funny thing? People were smiling more. Kids played outside without getting yelled at for noise. Families put up decorations early. People started talking again, not out of fear, but solidarity. As for me, I was approached by a few residents asking if I'd consider running for a seat on the new HOA board. I respectfully declined. I wasn't interested in control, I just wanted peace. But I did offer to help them rewrite their bylaws with help from a real land use attorney to make sure this kind of abuse could never happen again. I even handed over a few of the forms and records I'd kept. Just so everything was transparent. Through all of this, I never raised my voice. I never made threats. I didn't fight dirty. I just stood my ground, used the law, and let the truth come out, and when it did, it burned brighter than anything Karen could have lit with her 911 call. I often think back to that day, the sun shining, the quiet sound of water draining from my pool, and Karen storming down the road like she owned the place. She really thought she had won. She really thought the rules bent to her will. But what she didn't realize was that her desire to punish me revealed the very foundation of corruption she and the board had built their power on. She picked the wrong person to mess with. And in doing so, she didn't just lose a petty battle. Over a swimming pool, she triggered the downfall of everything she thought she controlled. The pool is still here, by the way. Sparkling clean, peaceful, just like it should be.